Confidence might often be seen as an admirable trait, but for a lot of people, it's all too easy to make the jump into overconfidence or arrogance. In a majority of cases, like most people assessing themselves to be of above average intelligence, or your mate Damo making $10 on the stock market and deciding he's the next Warren Buffett, the consequence of taking self-belief too far might be limited or individual. When you're talking about warfare and defense economics, though, the consequences of arrogance and overconfidence can be lethal in nature and geostrategic in scope. From Crassus' invasion of Parthia to Agincourt and Little Bighorn, there are no shortage of campaigns or battles where you could argue that arrogance helped shape the outcome, as Russia's 2022 invasion plan would pretty clearly attest. But today, I want to look at its potential role in something broader, operating alongside things we've talked about in the past, like cultures of corruption or inaccurate reporting, to not just swing individual battles, but to wear away at a country's ability to fight war in the first place. Whether that be by misreading opponents at a strategic level, failing to adapt force design and doctrine, or being blind to the winds of technological change. So to do that, we're going to step through a couple of points in sequence, starting with a bit of arrogance and overconfidence 101 and why it might matter in an organisational context. Then we're going to talk about the magnifying factor, how cultures overly focused on compliance or groupthink can turn arrogance from an inconvenience into a potential lethal vulnerability, and then two main ways, with historical examples, of how this can play out to undermine a nation's warfighting or economic potential. Firstly, by providing a barrier to organisational or doctrinal reform, and secondly, to creating a sense of inertia when it comes to adopting or acknowledging the threat of new technologies. Before finally to close out, we'll talk mitigation, aka how might militaries, businesses and governments try and avoid some of these traps that have snared so many before them. But before we get into it, let me welcome back a returning sponsor. Previously, I introduced you to Odoo, an all-in-one family of business software with 45 plus business applications covering a range of purposes. And today, I want to show you what Odoo can do when it comes to project management. With Odoo, tracking progress, deadlines, and resources can be simple enough. First, we can create projects, set up stages and tasks, including priorities, tags, and deadlines, then assign them. Helpfully, descriptions here don't have to be plain text. You can include things like tables, images, and videos as well. Once you're set up, Odoo can then help you collaborate, manage, and monitor efficiently. You can leverage the built-in chatter, send emails, add notes, tag colleagues, and attach files to any task. Plus also, schedule things like calls, meetings, and reminders. And jumping over to another example project for a moment, to maintain awareness, you can also pick a project view that suits you. Kanban, which organizes tasks by stage and lets you move them around like sticky notes. A classic Gantt chart to give you a timeline overview of your tasks and their dependencies, or a simple list view. It may not be able to physically do the projects for you yet, but when it comes to organization, awareness, and communication, it might go a long way. And helpfully with Odoo, your first application is free to keep for life. That includes hosting and support, as well as a personalized domain name free for the first year. If you're interested in checking out Odoo, there will be a link in the description. And so with my thanks to them, let's get back to it. Okay, so why have I decided to cover arrogance and overconfidence in the same series as things like corruption? The answer is because just like graft or bullshit reporting, things we've covered before, arrogance can be severely damaging to a military's performance, albeit in a slightly different way. If you think about a very general case, corruption is going to target a military's physical assets. It's stuff. You're not going to have the assets you should, or they won't be as good as they should be, because somewhere along the way, resources were diverted towards General Oligarchov's mansion instead. Bullshit reporting instead targets a military's information. It means equality in the data and the inputs that are reaching commanders and decision makers is going to be undermined, meaning they're making decisions based on bad information. Arrogance operates slightly differently. When you have an overly arrogant or overconfident commander, it's not so much that the data they're being fed is wrong, it's that they might believe that they're better than the data, and they end up making decisions based on what they believe to be true rather than what the evidence suggests is true. Put another way, corruption is why you might be missing half your ammunition. Bullshit and reporting is attacking because you believe you still have all the ammunition when half of it's been stolen, while arrogance might be ordering the attack despite knowing that half the ammo is missing, because why would you need anything so banal as ammunition to defeat your opponent? There's a lot of ways this might manifest in a functional sense. A belief that your opinion should trump the data, even when it shouldn't, treating data that favours your opinion as much more reliable than data that doesn't, or alternatively, favouring the opinion of people who agree with you over the opinion of those that don't, because if they don't agree with you, they must be wrong. The phenomenon we're trying to describe here is sometimes referred to as the zebra, zero evidence, but really arrogant. And historically speaking, whether you're talking about business or military contexts, zebras are unfortunately all too common. There's another reason, besides just informing a tendency to ignore data in favour of opinion, that makes arrogance and overconfidence particularly dangerous when it comes to military planning. And that's that while you can think of it as a form of data or analytic error, it's a monodirectional error. What do I mean by that? Generally speaking, you would never expect intelligence or analysis to be perfectly right all the time. In fact, you'd seldom expect it to be perfectly right any of the time. That's why in so many contexts, when you see data or estimates presented, they'll come with error bars or with a range of estimates. And importantly, in a lot of cases, those errors are going to fall to both sides of the actual value. And in an ideal world, that combination of over and underestimates should push you relatively close to reality. Let's just say, hypothetically, that the year is 2021, and you're a major power planning the invasion of a neighbouring state. When you're coming up with a plan for that invasion, there are a lot of assumptions you're going to have to make based on the best intelligence available. How effective are your troops and your opponents? What's the determination of the government? What's the quality and effectiveness of the air defence system? How mobile and deadly is the opposing air force? What are their ammunition reserves? How might foreign powers respond, etc.? And based on this kaleidoscope of hopefully intelligence-driven assumptions, the entire shape of the operation has to come together. Everything from unit allocations to timetables and planned routes of advance, to what targets you plan to hit with what weapons on what timeline. If you get some of those assumptions wrong, but don't get them all wrong in the same direction, the result might not be utterly catastrophic. If, for example, you underestimate the will of the opposing government to resist, so they try and fight on harder than you want, but you overestimate the effectiveness of their troops, then maybe that political miscalculation is compensated for by greater than expected military success. The problem, if arrogance or overconfidence is your frame of reference for decision-making, is it tends to push all errors in the same direction. You might want to overestimate your own effectiveness and underestimate your opponent across the board, and end up in a situation where you attack with a partially mobilized army because you underestimate your opponent, undercook your initial missile campaign because you overestimate its likely effect, and then get badly slapped by a series of drone strikes because you underestimated the opposing air and drone force, and so had a bunch of your air defense systems either switched off, not set up, or jammed out by your own electronic warfare units. And while a lot of elements about Russia's invasion plan in February 2022 are going to be up for debate for years to come, I'd suggest the way that many Rosvardia, so National Guard units, were used in that campaign demonstrates just how much overconfidence was baked into the whole endeavour. Rosvardia's specialty isn't frontline combat, it's internal security, and some of the units encountered in Ukraine were reportedly carrying things like riot control gear. But as planning assumptions rapidly divorced from reality in February 2022, for many Rosvardia units, rioters rapidly became the last of their worries. As one report, which I'll link in the description, put it, quote, although primarily conceived as a rear area security force and intended to trail behind advancing Russian regular troops, Rosvardia units quickly found themselves in frontline combat as Russia failed to achieve a rapid victory and chaos ensued, leading to disastrous losses within the service. In some cases, as a result of limited planning flexibility, a lack of effective coordination among Russian forces, and a severe underestimation of Ukraine's will to fight, Rosvardia elements ended up advancing ahead of Russian army units and tried to secure their strategic targets independently. And as you can imagine, that Leroy Jenkins approach occasionally had catastrophic outcomes for the Russian units involved. Quote, on 25 February, for instance, a detachment of OMON and SOBR forces, reportedly from the Kemerovo region in Siberia, attempted to drive into Kyiv ahead of Russia's regular units, moving in light transport vehicles. Unsurprisingly, their column was ambushed and destroyed by Ukrainian defences while crossing a bridge over the Irpin River. More such cases would be reported elsewhere. Videos published between late February and early March, for instance, showed destroyed Rosvardia columns on a key road to Kharkiv. Obviously, in a literal sense, it was the Ukrainians who destroyed, in some cases, those very elite Russian Rosvardia units. But at a higher level, I'd argue it was the arrogance built into the plan, and the assumption the Ukrainians would just roll over, that played a significant role in some of these units racking up the casualties they did. While that kind of grand strategic planning scenario might represent a kind of generalised case though, I think history makes it abundantly clear that arrogance can operate in a range of ways for a range of reasons, from the absolute top all the way to the bottom of military and political structures. The how of this playing out can obviously vary. It might be a case of individual ego, a commander or a system that's been successful in the past, deciding that just because they've been successful once or multiple times, they'll inevitably be successful in the future. History is replete with examples of commanders who repeatedly defeat superior enemy forces, only to eventually start to base their plans on their ability to do that consistently, and then eventually, inevitably, have a hard day at the office. Even though, just like corruption or a culture of bullshit and misreporting, what arrogance and overconfidence looks like at different levels of an organizational structure can be very, very different, it is in a sense an equal opportunity saboteur. It provides absolutely everyone, from Private Conscriptovich all the way up to General Oligarchov himself, an opportunity to do their part for the war effort, the opposing war effort. So to illustrate, just as we have with those other phenomena, let's walk down those levels in turn. At a grand strategic level, you're talking about very senior decision makers, perhaps national leaders themselves, somehow fundamentally misreading some reality of that geostrategic chessboard, with one of my favourite recurring historical examples being, if you like, the they wouldn't dare era, where an unfortunately overconfident leader decides that other countries wouldn't possibly dare challenge them if they were to do X, Y, Z, only for that opponent to turn around and basically go, bet. Even if we limit ourselves just to a 20th century highlight reel, there's a lot of examples to cite there. Many in the Russian Empire were convinced the Japanese wouldn't dare attack them in 1904, but the Japanese did, and Russia got wrecked. Hitler was convinced in 1939 that he could invade Poland and that France and the United Kingdom wouldn't declare war. They did, and after many, many additional steps, Germany got wrecked. Japan assumed the United States would negotiate a settlement rather than fight a war to the end. We know how that one ended. General MacArthur in Korea was convinced that UN forces could push further and further north, and the Chinese wouldn't dare move into Korea in force to stop them. They did. And Saddam in 1991 seems to have been convinced that Uncle Sam wouldn't punt him back to Baghdad over the whole Kuwait thing, which ultimately resulted in General Schwarzkopf doing some storming Norman things. At a strategic level, arrogance and overconfidence has also set the stage for the destruction of many a military campaign. See as evidence basically any non-Mongolian invasion of Russia, or many of the situations historically where one side or the other has dramatically misjudged the strategic balance. There are cases, like the Franco-Prussian War in the 19th century, where both sides declared war basically by mutual assent. And if you happen to have a situation where both sides think a war is a good idea, it's a fairly safe assumption that one or the other might have entirely too high an opinion of themselves. In that case, it was unambiguously the French. Move down to the operational and tactical level, and you can find plenty of examples of battles or campaigns gone awry. During the Anglo-Zulu War of 1879, the invading British column under General Chelmsford initially showed their Zulu opponents a stunning lack of respect. On paper, Chelmsford's force of British regulars, colonial and native troops was going to be outnumbered by the Zulu defenders, but enjoy a significant technological advantage, taking breech-loading rifles and a small park of, at the time, modern artillery up against an opponent that was still armed with, in most cases, literal spears and shields. Perhaps confident in that advantage, Chelmsford proceeded to divide his force, and then, at his son Lawana, proceeded to disregard his own standing orders that any force encamped needed to fortify itself in place, with the British force essentially camping out in the open, without even forming a defensive laager by circling its wagons. The result was that despite taking heavy casualties, the larger Zulu force was able to overrun the British firing line. The force at the camp was essentially wiped out, with more than 1,300 killed. I bring up Islam Lawana though because it shows how quickly the boot can go onto the other foot when it comes to arrogance or overconfidence. After the battle, about 4,000 Zulu troops in one of the reserve units that hadn't been engaged famously launched an attack on the small fortified mission station at Rorke's Drift. As they would discover though, the ability to overrun a large British force in the open didn't translate into the ability to overrun a small British force in a fortified position, meaning that despite having a somewhere between 20 and 30 to 1 numerical advantage, the Zulu force was repulsed after taking casualties at a more than 25 to 1 ratio. But underneath all that, this is a phenomenon that can claim victims down to the individual soldier level. Think anytime someone has ever gotten lax on things like, firearm safety practices because they know how to shoot or they're not stupid, only to find out that any firearm can become a SIG SW, self-inflicted gunshot wound, if enough arrogance is applied to the process, or any other case of dumb shit being done out of a sense of arrogance and invulnerability. You can also have cases where history almost seems to want to openly punish acts of overconfidence, as with General Sedgwick during the American Civil War, who was reportedly walking around in the open trying to motivate his men by saying, quote, "Why are you dodging like this? They couldn't hit an elephant at this distance," end quote, before being shot by a Confederate sharpshooter moments later. The core point is this is the kind of human failing that can come for people, no matter what rank they wear or what position they hold. It's just that all else being equal, the scale of damage those individuals tend to be able to do as a result is often a product of how much power they might have to convert ego into organisational action. But here's the thing. If you're talking about arrogance and incompetence by itself, I'd argue you're really only talking about one half of the toxic equation. Arrogance and overconfidence might set the stage for a bad decision to be made, but ultimately, it's compliance that can enable it. Ideally, whether you're talking about a military or a workplace, when someone makes a bad decision for whatever reason, there should be controls to prevent it getting out of hand. If you're designing a project and someone pulls an overly optimistic number out of thin air, maybe a different unit could throw some cold water on those expectations. If the bright idea fairy happens to visit one particular leader, maybe another leader can swat that fey creature before she claims additional victims. The extent to which that check and balance process works is obviously going to vary context to context, organisation to organisation, but militaries and some particular power structures can be especially vulnerable. Why? Well, for one, out of necessity, militaries are hierarchical settings. It is absolutely going to be expected that those lower down the rank structure follow the instructions of those above. And to an extent, you can argue that absolutely has to be the case. Officers in higher ranking positions might have access to more information, a broader view of the battlefield, a greater understanding of the strategic and operational context. And of course, when you're talking about military activity, it might be necessary for individually irrational actions to be made for the benefit of the wider whole. From the point of view of a junior lieutenant or sergeant on the ground, charging that machine gun nest might not seem like an eminently logical thing to do. But in the context of a wider battle in a wider campaign, it might be the only logical thing to do. And so, out of necessity, militaries have to cultivate discipline, and they have to cultivate obedience, along with a degree of secrecy and informational opacity that might make it a tad more difficult for those outside the military to understand the details of every decision being made within it. So, hierarchical structure with layers of secrecy and a degree of opacity. Potentially a necessary combination if you want an effectively operating military structure, but if you're talking about controlling or checking the consequences of potentially stupid decisions, perhaps not the best combination. And it's one that potentially leads itself even more than a normal business or civilian organisation to a phenomenon not just of the zebra, who we discussed earlier, but also the threat of the hippo. Hippo in this case is an acronym for highest paid person's opinion. It refers to the assumption that the highest status person in the room, sometimes measured by how much they're paid, is automatically correct, even if there's technical specialisation involved, the basis of that decision is wrong, or everyone else in the room happens to be of a distinctly different opinion. While you might generally hope that someone's compensation package, or in the military context, their rank, might tend to be at least somewhat positively correlated with their experience and competence, you can imagine plenty of cases, not just where that correlation might be a bit shaky, but also where it might be borderline irrelevant. A lifelong Army officer might not be the right person to make decisions about Air Force technical procurement. A senior officer who's only ever deployed to Europe might be best placed to take some advice from local experts if they're deployed to the Middle East or Asia Pacific. And seeing a major IT program run by someone whose technical skills don't extend much beyond turning the thing off and on again is an organisational saga that's basically written itself time and time again. The problem is, the hippo doesn't give a shit about any of that. The hippo knows that they know best. And unless you have people or structures in the vicinity willing to go one-on-one, or at least many-on-one, with a creature with a crushing bite strength, your hippo is likely to get their way to the potential detriment of, well, everyone else. Potentially, including the hippo themselves. To give you an illustration of this force in action, let me take you back to the 19th century. The year is 1893, and we're in the Mediterranean. Britannia rules the waves, and two columns of British battleships and cruisers are sailing, roughly 1,200 yards apart, off the coast of Lebanon. This is an era where the naval challenge from future competitors like the United States or Germany is still very much nascent, and the Royal Navy has spent decades at this point as effectively the undisputed ruler of the world's oceans. Commanding this mighty force is Admiral Sir George Tryon on HMS Victoria. Admiral Tryon, in some respects, is an interesting figure, in part because he was big, bold, and had the kind of facial hair arrangement that would make any admiral of the Victorian era proud. As Dr. Andrew Gordon put it of the Admiral, quote, George Tryon was respected and feared. He was one of the most intimidating and capable officers in the Royal Navy at the time. His mind was a cascade of ideas and concepts, and he had very little time for anyone that stood in his way. He had performed brilliantly in the 1888 annual manoeuvres, where he'd made complete fools out of the main Channel Fleet. That really buoyed up his reputation and got him, I suspect, the command of the Mediterranean in 1891. End quote. It's been noted by some commentators that the Admiral was generally of the opinion that peace had made the Royal Navy soft. As one put it, quote, for over a century, the Royal Navy had ruled the waves unchallenged. It was getting soft, and Tryon knew that. End quote. Meaning he had a record of trying to push his fleet hard, train his fleet hard, and inculcate in his officers a sense of the initiative and aggression that had characterised the successful Royal Navy commanders of the past. Through a memorandum in January 1893, for example, he set out an expectation that safety should trump blind obedience to orders. Quote, when the literal obedience to any order, however given, would entail a collision with a friend or endanger a ship by running on shore or in any other way, paramount orders direct that the danger is to be avoided, while the object of the order should be attained if possible. The issue, of course, is that a commanding, intimidating individual telling you to show more initiative, while at the same time barking orders about how everything should be done, is a state of affairs that stands a little bit in tension. As the good doctor put it, quote, there was a conflict, of course, in Trion's agenda in trying to teach his juniors to interpret the situation and use their initiative, and Trion's formidable, overbearing presence, which actually deterred his juniors from doing exactly that. End quote. So we have a strong character in the form of an admiral who was of the view that the Royal Navy was going soft and needed to be kept on its toes. One way to do that was by introducing the unexpected, including in the form of unexpected manoeuvres. And so we come to a fateful day in June 1893, where Admiral Tryon essentially orders his fleet to chuck a bit of a Yui by turning towards each other and reversing direction. Using some typical Perun tier artistic talent, I've tried to illustrate what the Admiral seems to have been ordering on the right there. The two columns of the fleet, one led by HMS Victoria, the other by HMS Camperdown, would turn towards each other and then reverse direction. The issue, however, is the two columns at this point were about 1,200 yards apart, and all the bravery, skill, and initiative in the world can't change the rules of physics, nor can they change a ship's turning circle. And to execute this kind of manoeuvre, roughly 1,600 yards of separation would have been required. And so, in reality, what Tryon was actually ordering looked a little bit closer to this. If the two ships turned towards each other as ordered, their courses would overlap, with obviously negative consequences for all involved. This would not have been a mystery to the officers on the ships. The turning circle of a British battleship wasn't exactly classified information from the point of view of its crew, and some of the present officers would later testify that they did in fact understand what the turning circle of these battleships were. However, Tryon's flag captain doesn't appear to have raised any objection to the order, and it was signalled out, which means we can turn our attention to the next character in this tragedy, the commander of HMS Camperdown. Camperdown was commanded by Admiral Markham, a man who has sometimes been described as a peacetime, stringent Victorian officer. Probably a great pick for the Royal Navy at the time, but perhaps not the right person to be in this particular situation. As Andrew Gordon put it, quote, Markham was an example of someone whose peacetime attributes were exceptional. He was a very strict officer, he was very correct, he was always very good at looking after his men, and he was very good at polishing, painting, and supervising his ship's performance, end quote. What he apparently wasn't particularly good at doing was challenging his senior commander. So Markham, in this difficult position, had a couple of options. He could query the order, challenge the order, pretend not to receive the order, or outright disobey the order. So put in this position, multiple choice, what do you think Admiral Markham did? The answer, of course, was he did none of that, and instead he turned Camperdown towards HMS Victoria. Essentially, rather than have an awkward signalled conversation with his commander, Markham decided to ram and sink his ship instead. Now, in a sense, that characterization isn't entirely fair. It's reported he'd intended to signal his commander, basically asking, do you actually want us to do the turn that you're signalling? But before that signal could be made, Tryon signalled, quote, what are you waiting for, end quote. Rather than responding, clarification that you actually want us to ram you, Markham appears to have gone into immediate compliance mode and ultimately made the turn. And despite last-minute attempts to avoid the collision, rammed into the side of HMS Victoria, which didn't manage to close all of its watertight doors in time. 357 Royal Navy personnel went down with the ship, including Admiral Tryon himself, who, presumably having understood what had just happened, decided this might be the easier course than facing the inevitable Board of Inquiry. It was an accident that was absolutely foreseeable, absolutely preventable, and absolutely pointless, potentially made all the worse by some of the other decisions made immediately after the collision. Admiral Tryon, for example, appears to have been confident that Victoria wasn't actually in serious danger initially, and when he was told another British ship was lowering its lifeboats, he directed a message be sent telling them not to do so. A question to raise about compliance culture here would be to ask, who failed in that scenario? Was it Admiral Tryon for giving a stupid order? Was it Admiral Markham for following that stupid order and just assuming his commander would do something to avoid the collision? Was it the men around them? Was it the flag captain on Admiral Tryon's ship? Or, above all of it, was it the Royal Navy for creating an organisational culture that would have a man issue an order like this and have everyone else follow it? As you can imagine, the Royal Navy investigated the incident thoroughly and decided it was pretty much all Admiral Tryon's fault, who at this point had gone down with the ship and wasn't in a position to defend himself. Admiral Markham, meanwhile, despite claiming a peacetime kill on a Royal Navy battleship, wasn't disciplined. Quite the contrary, he was promoted Vice Admiral in 1897 and Full Admiral in 1903. When World War I later broke out, he would volunteer for wartime service, which the Royal Navy politely declined. But one wonders if an investigatory body looking at an incident like that today might come to a different conclusion, or how a situation like that might play out in general. That's an open question I'm very happy to leave to the veterans and active serving personnel in the audience. The core point here is that orders and decisions don't kill people so much as the actions or inactions that arise out of them. And so it's a question not just of how arrogance, overconfidence, or any other factor can generate bad decisions, but how structures can then execute those in a very damaging way. There are a couple of ways, for example, you can imagine the arrogant extending their influence over the organization and stripping away the structures that hold them in check. Promotion and selection structures, for example. If you think you're the reincarnation of Alexander the Great, what kind of officers are you going to promote? Those who think everything you say is brilliant, hang off your every word and execute without question, or those with the tendency to poke the occasional hole in your work? The dangers of sycophancy and selection bias apply in almost any field, but it's in the military where they can potentially have deadly consequences. So I'll say the critical element to all of this is to figure out not just how to place a check on arrogance or overconfidence, or prevent individuals showing those behaviours from taking senior political or military positions, but also how, on the understanding that almost inevitably they will attain those positions, you effectively place checks and balances around them, so they are potentially able to carry out their work without managing to draft invasion plans that are built out of 90% hopes and dreams, or sinking a battleship during peacetime. Because the damage that the arrogant and overconfidence can inflict in peacetime can be tremendous, even if it only becomes visible in a very costly and stark fashion once war finally breaks out. I've heard it said that the worst thing that can happen to an army is for it to lose a war. The second worst thing is for it to win one, because there is always a danger that a force, or even a nation as a whole, having emerged victorious from some great challenge, will decide that they have obviously solved warfare and lose some of the incentive to innovate. The translation of a Japanese term that might apply here is victory disease, which I think especially applies for us here because nothing feeds the ego quite like a win or three. The element I want to focus on here is very much the ground-up process of building a force. Under most circumstances, you don't start a war and then build a military, you go to war with a military that's been built well in advance. And human history has inevitably been a story of continuous advancement and adaptation in how people, states, and militaries do that. How they organise, how they raise, equip, and train their forces, how they fight once they get to the battlefield, how they command, and how they select those who command. And while we have generally seen models and technologies come along that steadily supplant those that came before, it's worth noting that a lot of the time, it's not the military hegemons of the time, those with the most respected and feared forces, that come up with that next critical step. The Greek hoplite-style phalanx won victory after victory over Persian-style armies, until they were comprehensively beaten time and time again by the Macedonian and then later Hellenistic phalanxes, which in turn dominated for a while, only to be later crushed by a new model, the Roman legion, which obviously didn't win every battle it fought, including against older-style militaries, but which, coupled with Roman capabilities in areas like logistics and force generation, ultimately proved to be the more flexible and strategically successful model. The danger, of course, is that you hit onto a winning model, fall into the trap of thinking you and that model is perfect, and then you let arrogance and complacency set in until all of the other powers out there who have a motivation to find a solution to the model you've developed come up with something to knock you off the podium. In this sense, I consider a winning military model to be something that allows a country and its armed forces to outperform their available resources. If the United States of 2025 was able to invade Canada, I wouldn't consider that proof the US necessarily has a winning military model. But if Canada was able to successfully invade the United States, then yeah, given the resource disparity, that might be worth a look at. Which brings us to our 18th century case in point, Prussia and the Prussian army. In the 18th century, there is no single German state in the way we think of it today. There are multiple states occupying what we now consider to be modern Germany. Prussia, as you can see marked in blue on the map here, wasn't even a particularly large one, and didn't have anything like the population or wealth of the great powers of the time. And yet, under King Friedrich the Great, commonly referred to as Old Fritz, the country seemed to almost make a habit out of going 1v just about everyone, and often coming out on top. The key here was the Prussian military model. For its size, Prussia had a very large, very well-trained, and incredibly well-drilled army that time and time again was able to give it the advantage over opponents with many times its available resources. In the late 1750s, for example, Old Fritz was in the unenviable position of having to fight France, Austria, Russia, and a number of other German states at the same time in order to maintain his hold over that circled province there, Silesia, which he'd seized from the Austrians in a previous war. In this context, Prussia was outmatched in terms of just about everything. Number of troops, number of cannons, national population, economic resources, you name it, and the gap wasn't small. But again and again, that military model and Fritz's leadership was able to bring home the W. At Rossbach in November 1757, Old Fritz took about 22,000 troops against more than 40,000 French and other Germans and comprehensively smashed them, taking fewer than 600 casualties while inflicting between 8 and 10,000 and effectively knocking France out of the entire thing, while also convincing Britain, presumably somewhat amused by seeing the French so humbled, to dial up their much-needed financial support for the Prussian war effort. Having done that, he effectively turned around to take on the Austrians at Leuthen, once again outnumbered and significantly. I'd argue the battle pretty clearly demonstrated what the well-drilled Prussian army was capable of. The bulk of the Prussian force was able to feint towards the Austrian right and then effectively pivot, march, and reform in line on the Austrian left flank. From there, a lot of elements had to come together. The Prussian artillery made a significant contribution. The infantry performed as they had to. And in the end, Prussia walked away with an against-the-odds win. Frederick had taken his force up against an opponent that outnumbered him basically fairly closely to 2-1 and inflicted approximately 3-1 casualties in the process. He also managed to seize approximately 116 Austrian artillery pieces, significantly augmenting his own force in the process. Now, as with any of history's venerated great commanders, I think it's important not to oversell the success of the leader or the model here. There were battles that the Prussians lost, and eventually that disparity in resources did begin to tell, with the army and the economy being worn down, only to be saved at the last moment by one of the great Deus Ex Machinas in history. In January 1762, Empress Elizabeth of Russia died to be succeeded by Peter III, who was a massive fan of Frederick the Great. He essentially immediately pulled Russia out of the war, gave back the territory it was occupying, switched sides in the entire conflict, gave Frederick a Russian corps to help him out, and asked basically nothing in return other than a Prussian noble title, reportedly writing to Frederick that he would rather have been a general in the Prussian army than the Tsar of Russia. Peter would last less than a year before being forcibly retired by the somewhat more stronger-willed Catherine the Great, but the Prussians had been given the opportunity and they took it. They won again against the Austrians at Berkesdorf with 2-1 casualties and then greater than 3-1 casualties at Freiburg, eventually securing a peace that, yes, left the Prussian state absolutely exhausted, but did leave it in possession of Silesia. And from the point of view of many in the Prussian leadership and many of the German states, being able to fight off most of the great powers of the time in order to keep it represented a victory in and of itself, which of course means this is where our lesson begins. We've established the evidence for the fact the Prussians had a winning model, but having won, they seem to have been content to rest on their laurels a bit, which would have been fine if there weren't powers out there innovating, like, one of the war's losers, France, now under the leadership of some random Corsican you may have heard of, Napoleon Bonaparte. Between Frederick's era and the mid-Napoleonic Wars, the French military system underwent a thorough revision, and in 1806, we saw those two models tested against each other. Prussia actually had an opportunity to begin mobilizing before the French did, confident apparently of the eventual result. Napoleon, as was his style though, decided to respond to being attacked by attacking in turn, moving into what we would now consider to be modern Germany, going on the attack and attempting to seize the initiative. The result was a pair of battles fought between the French and Prussian armies. Napoleon himself would encounter part of the Prussian force at Jena. You can see that depicted down the bottom of the map on screen here. On paper, Napoleon may have had more total troops present in the area, but only ended up doing battle with around 40,000 of them against roughly 55,000 Prussians. The result was stark, to an extent that you imagine old Fritz might have been grudgingly proud. 5,000 to 6,000 French losses against between 26,000 and 27,000 Prussians. But with only a mild numeric advantage to the French and Napoleon himself on the field, maybe it was just the Napoleon factor or bad luck, not enough for us to make any judgment about the comparative value of the models. Fortunately for us though, we have a second battle happening at about the same time. If we go back to that map I showed you before, in the northern corner, you can see this much smaller French force accidentally running into the bulk of the Prussian army. This is 3rd Corps under Marshal Davout, not Napoleon himself, running into the force commanded by the King of Prussia himself. And in that respect, everything set the advantage on the Prussian side. Napoleon wasn't present. The French were outnumbered roughly 26,000 to 64,000. And as the name probably suggests, Auerstedt wasn't exactly French home territory. The French won, inflicting 2-1 casualties, seizing the fields, and setting the conditions for the subordination of Prussia to France. 2 battles, 2 defeats, a catastrophic outcome for the kingdom, and an utter humiliation for its way of war. That's how I'd characterise the situation, and a number of Prussian figures present at those battles appear to have agreed. For those of you familiar with military history, a couple of the names of those present might stand out. Field Marshal Blücher, Karl von Clausewitz, who was captured, yes, the bloke who would ultimately write on war, as well as both von Gneisenau and von Scharnhorst. Something that united all of these figures is they didn't take to losing particularly well, and would subsequently throw their energy into reforming Prussia, its economy, its state, and its army, with incredible pace. The list of reforms that would follow in Prussia is almost too long to list. The old patchwork administration was done away with. There was the creation of a more unified state. There were tax and economic reforms. Serfdom was abolished in October 1807. Land reform took place in 1811, and the military was thoroughly reshaped. There was a movement towards national universal service. Corporal punishment was limited. A lot of officers were cleaned out of the service. The military administration was simplified. A new Prussian Ministry of War was established, and we saw the beginnings of a military reserve, the Landwehr. And you can imagine all of this taking place while Prussia is nominally a French ally, and its leaders are trying to reassure their French counterparts there is absolutely nothing to see here. Jena and Austerlitz took place in 1806. Less than 10 years later, with Blücher at the head, the Prussian army would again meet the French one at a little battle called Waterloo. And the rest, as they say, is history. The Prussian model would again kick the French one into the dirt, this time in the Franco-Prussian War of the 1870s. Prussia would lead the reunification of Germany, until again, arguably falling into the trap of arrogance and overextension in time, fighting 2 world wars in the context of deep resource disparities. And I'd argue that if you look across the scope of military history, you can see that pattern of an innovative actor challenging an arrogant incumbent, winning, only to become confident, arrogant, and then overextend in turn, time and time again. Japan would be shocked into opening by the US arrival, significantly innovate and overhaul its military and economic model, and then build a steadily more toxic level of strategic confidence over the course of several victories. You can argue the First Sino-Japanese War convinced the Japanese that they could win. The Russo-Japanese War convinced some of them that they were unstoppable, leading to the Second World War against China, the United States, British Empire, and eventually Soviet Union, which proved they were in fact very, very stoppable. The United States would watch its primary geostrategic rival, the Soviet Union, collapse in 1991, leaving it the unchallenged global superpower, only to discover its own strategic limits, launching nation-building efforts in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. The core point here is that within an organisation, there's a tendency to become very confident in what you do and what's been proven to work. The danger, the organisational arrogance, if you will, comes in when saying, this is how we do things, or this is what worked in the past, becomes, this is the correct way to do things, and this will always be the correct way to do things. Military and strategic practice is constantly evolving, and there's always going to be incentives on those who want to challenge the status quo or unseat existing incumbents to find a new innovation, a new opportunity, a new approach that'll give them the winning model or the tools to do it. The challenge then for institutions is to find ways to encourage individuals to challenge their own doctrine, their own assumptions, to make sure that confidence born of victory doesn't eventually become a curse. And as to how you might do that, we'll come back to a little bit closer towards the end. Because for now, I want to move on to another area where arrogance and overconfidence can strike. Not in the area of doctrine, tactics, or organisation, but technology. Some of history's most successful militaries and businesses have been those that are quick to identify the potential value of a new disruptive technology and win the race to develop and leverage it against potential competitors. At the other end of the spectrum are those that essentially get blockbusted, with one of the significant dangers here being that having become a leader in a given technology or area, it's possible for people to become a bit blind to new technologies that might challenge their particularly cherished area of incumbency. And while there are many civilian examples of technological overconfidence, military history is replete with more than a few as well, with there almost always being some who correctly read the technological tea leaves and those that don't. There are a lot of different ways that historically this kind of thing has manifested, from becoming overly attached to a favoured technology, overlooking potential risks to favoured systems and platforms, or overlooking potential foreign developments and lessons learned because, what do they know? And those lines of thought, among others, can all have their own consequences, with a major one being that a force or individual is too slow to see the potential opportunity or threat posed by some new technology. For a potential case in point, see the quote I have on screen on the right there. quote, "The tank was a freak. The circumstances which called it into existence were exceptional and are not likely to reoccur. If they do, they can be dealt with by other means," end quote. That quote is generally attributed to a British officer speaking in 1919, about 20 years before the Second World War, where tanks famously played very little part. While the general trend across many of these incidents is becoming overly attached to a technology you know, I'd argue there are a number of subtly different ways in which this kind of arrogance and overconfidence can manifest. Firstly, a failure to be open to potential vulnerabilities. Think new systems that might threaten the survivability of a platform you become particularly attached to, or potentially alternatives that might threaten to supplant them in their intended mission. A bomber commander in the 1950s who would stick their fingers in their ear whenever discussion of surface-to-air missiles came up, or armour officers in the 2020s who would like to continue to plan around a world in which drones don't really exist, are both hypothetical examples that would potentially fall into that category. That might operate alongside overconfidence in existing and valued systems. If you were an officer in a navy dominated by battleships, trained by former battleship commanders, that had won its previous naval victories using battleships, then that might fill you and some of the other officers in the Navy with a degree of, shall we politely say, overconfidence as to the potential importance and cost-effectiveness of those battle wagons in a future conflict. That kind of overconfidence might not prevent the development of new technologies or systems, like aircraft carriers at the time, but it could potentially starve them of resources, from research and development and procurement funding to crew allocations. Then there's what I've sometimes heard referred to as the "we didn't invent that" problem, where a country might be quick to dismiss a technology just because they're not the ones who came up with it or are leading in it. As well as creating technological blind spots, this can also potentially close nations off to the potential of imitation. While duplicating technologies is sometimes described in a disparaging fashion, historically speaking, you could argue that for military development, it's one of the most cost-effective models out there. You get someone else to invest the blood, sweat, and tears necessary in order to do the development work out the kinks, and then field something with battlefield utility. And then after all that's said and done, you swoop in and flagrantly copy their homework. Sure, in school that might be against the rules, but from nuclear weapons development to space programs and fighters, we've often seen states decide that cost-effectively keeping up is significantly more important than being able to say that you honestly did all the work yourself. It likely cost the Soviet Union significantly less resources to duplicate the American B-29 as the Tupolev Tu-4 than it would have for them to design something with equivalent capabilities from the ground up. The barrier then is when individuals or institutions might not see the potential benefit of imitating or learning from other examples out there because they're utterly convinced that no one else's technology could be worth imitating. And potentially, as an even more dangerous extension on that, the assumption that just because you're not able to make a given technology work, no one else will be able to do so either. Sometimes that view might be born of genuine arrogance, in other cases, bad data, or simply judgments and assumptions that don't end up being borne out. But whatever the case, the risk, again, whether you're talking about military or civilian development, is that you allow some other actor to steal a technological march on you by giving up on a development effort while they push forward. One relevant example here that we've talked about previously on the channel is in the area of rocket reusability. In the 2010s, even as SpaceX was making very public advances in the area, the leaders of some of the established rocketry incumbents were making public statements suggesting they weren't entirely convinced. In 2016, the CEO of Ariane Space reportedly said the European company wouldn't change course one iota after SpaceX's reusability advances, that the economics of reuse were very complicated, and they liked the design of Ariane 6 as it was. While in 2016, Russian state media ran the headline that you can see on the right there, quote, "Russia's chief research institute doubts effectiveness of reusable rockets," with the subline suggesting that, quote, "the economic feasibility of reusable launch systems is not obvious," end quote. Fast forward a bit, and we would later see the CEO of Roscosmos say that reusability might be the future of rocket development, but that they were entirely capable of competing with SpaceX for the moment. Spoiler alert, they weren't able to compete. In Q1 2025, leaning on its largely reusable Falcon 9 rocket, SpaceX lifted more than 477 tons of material into orbit, Roscosmos closer to 12. Even as that inflection played out, though, there appear to have been some Russian voices that refused to accept that the technology was partly to blame. To quote Katya Pavlushenko, "No matter how many times you repeat this, Roscosmos is deeply convinced that SpaceX receives funding from NASA and the military, and this is the reason for the low cost of your launches. I tried to talk to some people from the Russian space industry about reusability. They looked at me as if I didn't make sense," end quote. One of the big dangers here for militaries is you often don't get unambiguous proof that a technology works and is potentially devastating on the battlefield until it actually gets used in a relevant scale conflict. Think drones in the Ukrainian context as one very salient example. But if you dismiss a technology or family of technologies until an opponent or competitor successfully uses it in a major conflict, it may be far, far too late to prevent them getting a major strategic advantage from doing so. You might find yourself starting from scratch or the halfway point when the missiles are already flying and half the R&D interns have been drafted. In the worst case scenario, a bad call or two in this area might be enough to skew an entire conflict. Because if a significant chunk of your investment and defense industrial system has been key to producing a technology that is suddenly obsolete or less significant because some new disruptive technology has come along, then your opponent may not give you the luxury of the time you need to retool and readjust on the fly. The key imperative then is to try and honestly identify those potentially disruptive technologies, those vulnerabilities, those opportunities, before you find yourself in a war or crisis that forces you to do so. So what are some examples of what that might look like? It might mean close contacts between defense and industry. So when they come up with something interesting, the military is quick to hear about it and understand what that might potentially mean. It might mean good intelligence work, closely monitoring foreign developments, both military and in the openly published academic literature, and of course paying very close attention whenever we see new technologies actually used, whether that be in smaller scale or irregular conflicts, or in major conventional conflicts like Ukraine. I'd argue, for example, that Ukraine is significantly ahead of most NATO states on the drone technology and tactics curve. And so those allied states would do well to try and understand those technological developments, the doctrine that supports them, and to take full advantage of some of those lessons the Ukrainians are learning at such a high price. Because in that kind of context, learning a lesson or developing a technology for the first time is expensive, copying a friend's work, not so much. You don't have to assume that the Ukrainian and Russian militaries are better in everything that they do, and we previously talked about some of the deep deficiency both of those sides have on this channel. But just because they have those shortfalls doesn't mean they don't have some significant lessons to teach. Outside the context of observing very real conflicts that are playing out, I think there's also something to say here about the process of doctrine development, force design, and wargaming that can take place during peacetime. A key point to make up front here is that military wargames and exercises require resources, they're not free, and where they're undertaken, they tend to take place with a specific goal in mind. It's often not going to be a good luck, have fun scenario where all sides involved try their best to win at any cost, but instead with a very specific training goal in mind. What that means is that in order to be efficient, there often have to be certain scenario parameters or guardrails put in place to make sure that value is actually delivered. If you had an exercise scenario, for example, that required the Air Force to come in, suppress the opposing air defense system, and then for Marines to land on an enemy beach, if you get to day 2 and decide the defenders have done too good a job, the air defenses haven't been suppressed, that might be all well and good and make the red team feel great about themselves. But now you have a bunch of Marines sitting there who don't get to do what they're there to do, practice landing on a beach. And so rather than sending them all off to the pub for the rest of the week, you might decide to proceed with the scenario on the assumption that the air suppression has been successful. Similarly, if you want to practice an air assault and all of the helicopters carrying the troops are blapped on the way in, you might want to unblap them and have the exercise go ahead, rather than bringing the troops home early and forcing them to watch a supercut of helicopters going down in Michael Bay movies. The point is that carefully designing scenarios or skewing assumptions can have a legitimate military purpose. The potential risk is that arrogance or overconfidence might lead forces to bake assumptions into those scenarios that support their existing view of how things should work, rather than what the data suggests might actually work. Depending on the context, there's a near infinite number of ways that could potentially play out. What sort of drones, weapons, and other systems do you assume your opponent in a particular scenario has? How do you assume they use them? How capable are they? And how free are those playing the role of that opposing force to get creative and try and see how they can use different tools, actual or hypothetical, to put the existing doctrine and simulated force under pressure? Examples of dangerous assumptions here might be presuming your opponent will act in an incompetent fashion, or in a way that politely cooperates with your intended battle plan. In other cases, assumptions might be baked into models themselves. What do you assume is the technical reliability and accuracy of an opposing missile system? How effective do you assume your own missile defenses are? That kind of thing. With the observation I'd make here being that you arguably need a balance. You're probably going to want wargames and exercises with enough boundaries set around them that you can actually practice the intended skills, but at the same time, there may be a time and place for slightly more chaotic exercises, perhaps intended not so much to teach skills as test assumptions. In the case of drone warfare and its tactics, for example, I remember being asked at an event relatively close to the original Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, one example of what I'd want to see Western militaries doing based on what we were seeing in the open source. My somewhat glib suggestion at the time was that you get a tiny training budget and then hand an infantry platoon or company a couple of duffel bags full of drones, along with a brief primer on how the Ukrainians were using them, and then have them run a couple of platoon on platoon or company on company exercises, matching the force with the drones against an equivalent without, with the idea being to create a little bit of chaos, enable some creativity, and provide a little bit of a demonstration of what capabilities this kind of technology might be able to give to the existing force with comparatively little investment. Sure, it might make for a slightly more chaotic environment, but that might have teaching value all of its own. Now, to be fair, that was a somewhat glib response, and you'd probably want to be a bit more deliberate about how you ran an exercise like that. But I think the core point there is the same. War games and exercises can be used to train, but they can also be used to challenge, to experiment, and to test. The key, I'd argue, is not being overconfident about what assumptions merit testing or challenge. Another potential risk area is if assumptions built off arrogance or overconfidence get baked into the requirements for equipment. In some contexts, it might be tempting shorthand to base the requirements for what you need in the future based on what you already have and are confident in. But there obviously needs to be a point where forces step back a bit, read the strategic environment, and go back to basics somewhat on what they're trying to achieve and what they need to achieve it. But instead of going down that particular procurement rabbit hole as we get towards the end of the presentation, let's instead zoom out a bit. We've talked a lot about some of the risks here and how it can all go wrong. But considering we're trying to put a check here on a very common human behaviour, at a high level, how might militaries, businesses or governments go about trying to mitigate this? Especially given you probably don't want to go too far and run the risk of not learning any lessons from past successes and valuing what has actually been proven to work in the past. The first thing to say is, like some of the other phenomena we talked about, like corruption, politics, or falsified reporting, there's no magic wand solution here. This is people being people and acting in line with very human incentives. And so until our new robot overlords are ready to assume higher command duties, this is probably something to control for rather than eliminate. But while you probably can't stop some people thinking they're top shit, there are a couple of things you probably can do. Firstly, trying to guard against the consequences when this does happen. That might mean solid contingency planning. So if things don't go according to the originally over-optimistic plan, the force is in a better position to adapt to the reality it actually encounters, and hopefully still achieve at least some of the original objectives. An aside there would be that contingency planning should probably go both ways in some cases, because if a force ever finds itself in a situation where things are actually going better than originally expected, it might be handy to have plans and resources in place to potentially exploit that set of circumstances, rather than allow an opponent the time and breathing room necessary to potentially find their balance again. I'd argue the war in Ukraine has given us plenty of examples where that kind of contingency plan would have been useful, where the Russians or Ukrainians were inadequately prepared for something that ultimately went wrong, or where they missed an opportunity to exploit the situation when it went right. You can think of that approach as an attempt to protect yourself against the consequences of analytic error. So if arrogance does skew things, you're not entirely screwed. But you might also want to look for ways to reduce the probability of that kind of error happening in the first place, focusing on the decision makers and decisions rather than the consequences of them. You can look at how, from a process perspective, a military or organization seeks out data, how it analyzes that data, and how it selects and trains individuals to make decisions based on the information available. Some of that might be formal, in terms of how decisions are made or reviewed, and some of it might be cultural. In an ideal world, you probably want a situation where productive forms of critique aren't considered to be the enemy, where someone shooting a couple of holes in a higher-ups plan might actually be considered a good thing if it saves some soldiers being shot through later on. I mean, think of how different things might have been if just one Death Star engineer had had the courage to stick their hand up and ask why a battle station, operating in a vacuum, needed a straight-line thermal exhaust port wide enough to serve as a delivery chute to the main reactor. Sure, most real-world organizations don't actually force-choke people who speak up about potential flaws or issues, but that doesn't mean they always get the balance right either. While it may not always be possible in some contexts, say under fire where very rapid decisions are required, when you're talking about much longer-term decisions, think force design or defense industrial policy, you probably want to create a situation where you have capable individuals with the incentive to try and make sure that your processes, evidence, and ultimately your decisions are as robust as possible, without either A, requiring them to commit career suicide in the process, when they run into some arrogance or overconfidence head first and someone decides to make the person go away rather than the argument, or on the other end of the spectrum, rewarding people for being obstructionist for obstructionism's sake. Because if you just make all opinions equally valid or give too many parties the ability to hold up a decision-making process, the result can be scenarios that could inspire an entire episode of their own, designed by committee, which gives you things like the French hotel battleships of the 19th century, or potentially just decision-making paralysis. And while sure, a scenario where leaders are expected to take advice and counsel while still retaining the ability to act decisively and with initiative, might sound like a bit of an idealised situation that would be difficult to develop in reality, I'd argue many militaries already strive to have that kind of relationship in place. It's understood in many forces that a relatively junior officer, like a lieutenant commanding a platoon for example, holds that command and has the powers and responsibilities that come with it, but it's generally expected they heed any advice or input from the platoon sergeant or other experienced non-commissioned officers when they speak up with advice or input. And as one officer once put it to me, any junior officer with more sense than a cinder block will listen to their sergeant. And in many cases, one imagines the troops in that formation will be happy for that fact, given the sheer number of historical examples you could cite, where the causal pathway from overconfident junior officer to very high unit casualties was a very short one. Sure, the process doesn't always work perfectly, but some of that intended dynamic between officers and NCOs, I think, proves that you can organisationally and culturally create relationships where decision makers are expected to take input and advice without necessarily destroying hierarchies or gumming up the decision-making process. A civilian example of a similar phenomenon might be found in the medical field. A doctor mate of mine once told me he thought there was a term for junior physicians who didn't think they ever needed to listen to anything the nurses, especially the experienced nurses on the ward, had to say. He called them idiots, but stressed that when there was a solid relationship between the two, the primary winner, a lot of the time, was going to be the quality of patient care. My point is it's possible to introduce checks and input points into an organisation without necessarily abolishing a hierarchy, although obviously what that might look like would depend a lot on the organisational context. I'm not sure you can just stick a warrant officer in every cabinet meeting and have them yell at people if they propose invading a country they really shouldn't, but however it's implemented, you get part of the ideal. Making sure you have people and processes where it matters, they can look at the evidence, speak truth to power, and if necessary, check egos. Because the alternative, just as with allowing a culture of false reporting, is that the gap between what officers, leaders, politicians, or entire institutions believe to be the case and what is actually true can tend to widen. And while the cost of that collective error might be difficult to detect during peacetime, if war does break out and overconfidence and reality end up going head-to-head, the latter tends to get the casting vote every time. And okay, channel update to close out. Obviously, this one's releasing a bit off the regular schedule, so thank you very much for your patience with that. As I said in the community post though, I'm hoping things should become a bit more regular again in a couple of weeks. This episode's been in the works for some time. The question was always just what is the right time to release it? And given just how long it's been since our previous entry in the Destroys Armies series, I thought now was as good a time as any. For the patrons, after a bit of a delay, your topic poll should be up by the time this one releases. So if you haven't already, please jump over and give your thoughts on what topics you'd like to see prioritised in the near future. I obviously can't make any promises, especially if major world events intervene, as they've done shockingly often in 2025 so far. But as always, I'll take it into account and do my best. Beyond that, thank you very much for your support and engagement as always, and of course thank you to Odoo for sponsoring this episode. And with that said, hope to see you all again later this week.